Welcome everyone. In this video, we're going to cover some router basics, and then I'm going to give you my 7 best router tips and tricks. Let's get started. Typically when you go and purchase a router, there are 2 variations on the style of router that you can buy. One's called fixed base and the other one is a plunge cut. Fixed base is where you set the depth of that router bit and that doesn't change for the entire length of your cut or your working operation. Or you have to, you just go around your workpiece, or if you have to go in the center, you have to gradually climb your way into the cut. Plunge cut is where it kind of looks like this with 2 handles and it's got springs on it and you can actually plunge your bit into the workpiece and then begin to move and cut. So depending on your need, you can pick those 2 different types of routers. Of course, you've got corded and cordless. Cordless routers typically aren't used for really big jobs. The battery doesn't last, more than maybe an hour in some of my cases. They're about 1 horsepower. They're typically called edge band or edge routers, not edge band, edge routers for light jobs. You want to pick up maybe 1.5 to 2 horsepower routers for really big jobs where you're taking just massive cuts, off of something like this. So it lasts. Routers in at least the US come in 2 different sizes. And when I say sizes, that means the accepted shank. So this part is the shank of the router bit, and this is a 1/2 inch, and then this is a 1/4 inch. So all 3 of these are 1/4 inch, but if you do buy a router that can accept a 1/2 inch shank into the cullet, and the cullet is essentially the sleeve that shank goes into. If you buy a router that accepts a 1/2 inch shank, it oftentimes comes with, or you can purchase optionally, a swappable cullet where you can actually use your 1/2 inch or your 1/4 inch router bits as well. So kind of versatile. If you get a bigger router that does 1/2 inch, you can also use your 1/4 inch with a smaller sized cullet. So that's a really good tip for if you're purchasing new routers. I do want to talk about 2 variations on the material that router bits can be made of. Most of the time you're going to find router bits are made from, I don't know what you would call it, just common steel, maybe 1080 or 1020 or whatever normal, high carbon steel might be. And then there's other ones called carbide. Carbide are much more expensive. They've got a different sound to them. If you can hear it. And their edges stay sharper much longer, but they're brittle. So they serve really good purposes when you're doing, fine woodwork, because the edges are just super sharp all the time. But be careful, because if you drop them, they'll crack. They don't rust really hardly at all. Carbides, so these are really useful for kind of fine woodworking when you got to do a lot of deep cuts. You want to make small passes and then adjust it down maybe a 1/4 inch at a time. So carbide is 2 different types, normal steel and then carbide. Just keep that in mind when you're actually buying router bits. Keep in mind if you need, one or the other, whatever you need, depending on the purpose. All right, let's get into my top 7 kind of router basics or tips and tricks. One thing I want to talk about is feeds and speeds. So you might hear people talk about feeds and speeds, maybe in circles of using CNC machines, but you can still use the terms feeds and speeds with handheld routers. And most common current routers should give you an indication on the machine and which way the router is spinning, the router bit is spinning, because that's very important when you're routing. Oh yeah, so there's an arrow right here that kind of shows you the direction in which the router head is spinning. And this one is on top of the clear piece that I have installed on my router table. But it's important because you always want to, 99% of the time, use your workpiece or feed your workpiece into the spinning direction of the router bit. And one easy way of figuring that out is put your finger in the direction of the router bit, make a fist, and then curl your fingers. Whatever direction your fingers are curling, that's the direction in which the router bit is spinning. So if the router bit is spinning this way, you want to push and feed your wood piece into the direction of the router bit. So if you're on a table, if the router is up inside of a table, same thing, thumb up, directions this way, the router is spinning this way. You want to feed the workpiece this way into the bit. If you're actually doing a handheld exercise, put your thumb down because the bit's facing down, curl your fingers. That means the blade's spinning this way. So you want to feed the piece of wood against the bit that way. The reason why that's important is you don't want the bit to, if you did it the opposite direction, which is a climb cut, which there are very rare instances where you want to do a climb cut. You always want to do the reverse. If you do that and you're going the other direction, like with the blade, it could grab the workpiece and then spit it out. So that's what you're really worried about. So thumb up, put your thumb in the direction of whichever the blade is facing, either up or down, curl your fingers and follow your fingers, and that's the way the bit direction will be spinning. Number 2, tips and tricks. I've always found it, extremely helpful if you can get either a vacuum cleaner, either on blow or suck, and then a light that lights up the bit of where you're cutting. I don't hear this talked about often, but when you're routing something, especially on the inside of a workpiece, the wood chips will fill up the hole and you really can't see what you're doing. So this one's pretty good and actually has a light on it. So this is really helpful. But if you don't have one that has a light on it, get, a hand to have maybe holding a flashlight and a vacuum or a blower and blow the wood dust away as you're routing, because it's really important to see maybe the lines you've marked or if there's chip outs happening. You don't want to go blind into the cut and just rely on maybe the guide bearing for what you're doing. You really want to see what you're doing the entire time that you're cutting. So try and get some kind of dust system or a vacuum or a blower and light right where the cut is happening. All right, tip number 3. Oftentimes you'll find router bits that have a guide bearing on them, either on the top or on the bottom. And this guide bearing, you can see here, is used when you're maybe patterning something out. Let's say you're making a charcuterie board or, I don't know, something else. If you're batching out a ton of product or you're doing a gigantic table, for example, and you're using a guide bearing, what you want to be cognizant of is time. How much time have you been using on that bit? And stop and retighten that guide bearing. I've seen a ton of YouTubers, not a ton, but enough YouTubers where that guide bearing actually comes loose and they ruin their entire workpiece. And oftentimes your router work is almost one of the last steps on your project. And it's just heartbreaking to see that guide bearing come off and you just dig into your workpiece and it ruins the entire thing. So when you do put these guide bearings on, make sure they're nice and tight, and then don't hesitate to stop what you're doing and then retighten up these Allen wrenches or whatever guide bearing, whatever tool is holding on that guide bearing, and tighten it up, maybe every 5 to 10 minutes of usage if you're really batching out a ton of work like that. All right. Tip number 4, light passes. You might hear that common term when people are talking about routers, router bits. Light passes means if you're doing a plunge cut or a groove cut in a workpiece and you need to go down an entire inch or inch and a half, even though the bit is probably going to be able to survive that pass, if you do it all at once, it's going to cause problems. So I suggest only doing light passes of a 1/4 inch depth at a time, maybe 1/2 inch, depending on the type of wood. It's going to save your bits. It's going to prevent chip out. It's going to prevent smoking. When I say smoking, it means if you start to router too much of a pass as far as depth goes, you might start to see smoke and it's going to burn the workpiece. So light passes, it takes more time, but it's going to save your bits, it's going to save your workpiece, and it's probably even going to save your router motor as well. So I know it takes a little bit longer, but 1/4 inch passes at a time is usually the safest bet when it comes to routering stuff. All right, tip number 5, the sacrificial end block piece. So when you're routing and maybe you're coming to an end of your workpiece and you're noticing that there's like giant chip out. It also depends on which way the wood grain is facing on your workpiece. But if you find that you're getting a bunch of chip out when you get to the end of your workpiece, you can actually just mount a sacrificial block to the end of your workpiece. You can butt it up against something on the table. You can do hot glue. whatever you can do to get a sacrificial piece of wood on the very end. And then when you're routing the edge, it'll prevent pressure. It'll put pressure on that piece of wood on the end, and it won't do chip out. It won't break out depending on the grain direction. So they come in handy when it comes to preventing chip out on the end of your work pieces when you're routering. So it's kind of handy. All right, tip number 6. We'll call this one burning and smoke. I'll never forget a story a friend of mine told me one time when he was using his circular saw to cut some 2x6s. He said he just got a brand new blade and he was cutting them in his garage, and it was taking forever to cut. And the garage started filling up with smoke, but he eventually got through the cut. Took him like 5 minutes. And later on, he learned that he actually put the circular saw disc on backwards. And so the teeth were not even cutting into the wood the right direction. It was just using just the space of the teeth to finally cut through it. So that was kind of funny. And because of that, I'll always remember, like when I'm using the router bits, if I start to hear a whine when I'm routing, or if I see smoke or smell smoke, that means that I'm either trying to take too much in a pass, I'm going too slow, or the router bit is dull. So if you start to see smoke or the wood browning or burning as you're doing your router cuts, definitely stop and kind of reassess the situation. Are you taking it too much off? Is the router bit dull? Are you using the wrong type of router bit on the wrong type of surface or material? And then take a step back. So that could be dangerous when you start to see smoke and burning. Another thing is, oftentimes your router bits can also be used on light aluminum. So keep that in mind too. You can use router bits, other woodworking bits, on some light working aluminum as well. So keep that in mind. All right, the 7th and last tip comes to storage and cleaning. When you're using your router bits, oftentimes they might get some. You shouldn't be getting any sap on them, because really you shouldn't be using any sap wood in wood projects. But if you do get some buildup on your bits, just make sure you clean all that stuff off, even if it's just wood dust, before you store them away, because that'll essentially dig in and pivot into the metal over time. And if you're doing some really fine woodworking in the future with that same bit, those little micro divots or rust or specks in the blade are going to show through on the woodwork. So clean them before you store them. Store them in, something in a clean, dry place. Because you may see, like, oftentimes you'll notice that the manufacturers will provide these bits to you, and they'll be coated in like a rubber or a wax. And so that just is an indication that they do eventually wear or rust away, especially after heavy use on certain woods. So clean them before you store them. It'll keep them sharper longer. It'll prevent some little bits of corrosion that are microscopic, but they actually may show through eventually on some of your fine woodworking projects. All right, thanks for watching, everyone. Stay tuned or subscribe if you like. In the next video, I'm going to be making a display case for a bunch of 30, 40-year-old vintage matchbooks with a modern day twist.